Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Brendan Cole. The internet has transformed the way we communicate with each other, do our shopping, go on holidays. Microblogs like Twitter have fueled revolutions in the Arab world and provided a forum for people living in otherwise restricted media environments. But this freedom comes at a cost. Extremism websites have proliferated. The sheer amount of information we now have online has also, ironically, put some of those freedoms at risk. So just how free is the internet? Here to discuss that issue is Padraig Reidy. He's the news editor for the Index on Censorship, which campaigns for internet freedoms. We have in the studio here Dr. Paolo Tubaro, who's a senior lecturer in economic strategy at the Department of International Business and Economics at the University of Greenwich. She's conducted in-depth research into the impact of internet censorship. On the line, we have Alexei Leonov. He's the development director at the Russian Center for Safe Internet. And also on the phone from Saudi Arabia, we have Fahas Fatani. He's a stand-up comedian, among other things. He works in advertising and he also deals with a lot of censorship issues. And also on the line, we have Haris Rafiq. He's the director of Sentry, which is an organization that's focused on countering extremism. Thank you very much for joining us. Internet censorship, policing the internet. Is it a good thing or is it not? Padraig?
I'd have to say not. The web is a very, very new thing. We still don't quite know where we're going. I think the best analogy perhaps is the Wild West. But we tend to have a terrible impulse because we have this new technology, which allows us both unfettered freedom, but in a way unfettered censorship.
Paolo Tubaro, should the internet be policed?
Well, my research really shows that attempts to restrict internet freedom aren't always successful. So even without looking at factors such as the ethics and the law and the technicalities, if we just look at whether or not restricting freedoms achieves the purposes it is aimed for, it's not always the case. So we need to be very careful with that.
Alexei Leonov at the Russian Center for Safe Internet. I mean, what do you make of it? Is a free internet, should the internet be policed in any circumstance?
Of course, definitely. Because, internet and the web itself is just a part of our everyday life. So we want to live in a free world, in a free country, and we want to be free. So in this case, we want to be free in the web. But still, we have to remember that there are lots of kids in the internet, lots of minors and lots of adults who can be the victims of some sort of cyber crimes. And as in real life, we want to be safe and sound while walking the streets. We want to be safe during our internet life. So we have to make internet free, but we have to implement some instruments to make internet safe.
Fahas Fatani, you're in Saudi Arabia. You're in an environment which has less freedom than most parts of the world. I mean, what do you think? Do you think there should be some degree of policing the internet?
I don't think it's a simple yes and no answer to that. There's many facets to the issue. Culture is one underlooked facet to the issue of censorship. Culture has a very strong effect on the way people would accept or not accept certain things being viewed to them. You could take, for example, many Western countries during the 50s and 40s, where morality levels were a little different, and what people could accept and not accept to see, whether on or hear on the radio or on television, was very different to what it is today. And I think it's just a fact of different cultures progressing differently and maturing differently. I believe that policing the internet censorship when it comes to national security and the safety of the people, I think in that respect it is necessary. In respects to minimalizing certain information or knowledge or basically just news or anything that would benefit people, I don't agree with censorship in that respect.
Haris Rafiq, countering extremism, and I guess that extends to the online world. I mean, what do you think? Do you think internet freedom is alive and well, but should the internet be policed in any circumstances?
I think that's a very interesting question that you've asked. The internet plays a vital role in actually creating radicalization or terrorism and extremism. And if we're being policed in our everyday life, in our community, then I don't see why the same rules and regulations that apply in general life, i.e. newspapers or television or any other forms of media, I don't see why that shouldn't be policed. Just to give you an example, if you look at the Fort Hood murders or killings in the USA a couple of years ago, that's something, the chap who actually carried that out, Major Hassan, is somebody who was radicalized on the internet, and he had constant communication with a hate preacher, Anwar Awlaki, that actually took him to a stage in his life, in a position in his life, and where he wanted to go out and carry out acts of terrorism. So I think that policing in terms of the way that we police our general life is something that's very, very important in terms of our global cyber life as well.
But if that was the case, I mean, you could say that it would have, if there's a degree of policing, that's all very well and good in a functioning democracy, but in countries which are less democratic, let's take the social networking sites and microblogs like Twitter and the impact that they had in the Arab world. They would have been restricted. Fahas Fatani in Saudi Arabia, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that, do you see the value of freedom on microblog sites like Twitter and the impact that they've had in your part of the world?
Of course. Even starting my own career in stand-up comedy in Saudi Arabia, it wasn't very simple plan that we could just adapt really quickly like any other business, because there was a lot of issues. Paramount of most is censorship, of course, when it comes to what we can say and what we can't say, because comedy these days, the standards have gone up where people accept, in some cases, racy jokes or jokes towards religion or politics and sex, and these are things that are basically censored in Saudi Arabia for religious and cultural reasons. And to circumvent this problem, we had to find ways to basically adapt to the culture. But when it comes to the internet, we're much more free to express ourselves as much as we can, because the internet, through Facebook and Twitter, we're not as censored here in Saudi Arabia as we are in other countries. My mother is Egyptian, and living in Egypt for a while, I've met a lot of people who, during the Arab Revolution, the Arab Spring, and they relied on it so much to just get their voice out and to contact family abroad. But when the internet got shut down, I guess that's the ultimate form of censorship, you know.
But also, on the other hand, we have. These kinds of revolutions which are fueled by Twitter. There's a downside to Twitter, isn't there? I mean, there's. I'm going to ask Podrick here from the Index on Censorship. The downside of Twitter is that you can basically say what you like. You can, in fact, a high-profile case of a footballer who was convicted last week of raping a 19-year-old, and her name was revealed on Twitter and discussed openly amongst Twitter users, whilst Twitter helps give a voice to people who would not normally have one in restricted media environments. It's also open season, isn't it? And shouldn't there be some regulations?
I think Harris Rafiq pointed out something which is true in a way. The internet is not an entirely separate thing anymore. It's a part of everyday life. It's almost an anachronism to talk about the internet as separate to everything else. And interactions on the web are subject to the same laws and same restrictions that we have in everyday life. We saw last year with super injunctions, for example, and we've seen, you say, only this week with the Ched Evans rape victim. Those people will be pursued for contempt of court, just as they would be in real life. But it does become complicated because, particularly with social networking, we are in a strange position somewhere between publishing and social interaction, like we would in a cafe or in a bar. So people have a feeling sometimes that they're just talking to each other without thinking, actually, now I am publishing. And our laws have not caught up with this yet. We don't really know where we're going to head with this. But I would dread to think that that the impulse would be to restrict more than we already do restrict. We already have libel laws. We already have contempt of court laws. And all these laws which do, to a certain extent, restrict freedom of speech.
But I suppose, contempt of law, that's a legal issue which is obviously not considered acceptable. But Hugh Grant has called for restrictions on Twitter due to, he doesn't want salacious details of celebrities to be revealed, which doesn't really have a legal aspect. He's right, though, isn't he? There's a right to privacy for celebrities, and Twitter is open season.
Well, again, if a law is broken, then a law is broken. We may not agree with those laws necessarily. We have problems with libel laws. We have problems with privacy laws. But if a law is broken, then the law has been broken. The last thing I would want is for a private company such as Facebook or Twitter to begin to make their own laws, and that would be even more restrictive than the laws of the land.
Paolo Tabarro from the University of Greenwich. You've done research on internet censorship and restriction, and in particular you were looking at websites that promoted anorexia. Also, you looked at the London riots last year and the effect of the internet on those. What do you make of a degree of censorship? Surely it can be counterproductive, can't it?
Yes, that's really my point. That in the case of the riots, for example, Facebook, Twitter, and these tools were used, and that was the great accusation, to coordinate unlawful action, but also to coordinate more positive initiatives like the cleanup in the streets and all that. So restricting access would stop both of them and would prevent, in fact, some positive influences to actually display their effects, and that could help a lot to calm down the situation. It would be very difficult to tease out the two in principle. So stopping access, in fact, would perhaps stop some violence, but stop the initiative of citizens that itself might help to bring the situation to calm again.
You're listening to Voice of Russia with me, Brendan Cole, here in London. We're talking about internet freedom. Joining me is Padraig Reidy, who's the news editor for the Index on Censorship, Dr. Paolo Tabarro from the University of Greenwich, Alexei Leonov, the development director at the Russian Center for a Safe Internet. On the line, we have Fahaz Fatani from Saudi Arabia. He's a stand-up comedian. And also on the line, we have Haris Rafiq, the director of Sentry, an organization which is focused on countering terrorism. I'm going to turn to you, Fahaz Fatani, in Saudi Arabia. There are many parts of the world where there is a lack of media freedom. You mentioned earlier on that in Saudi Arabia, actually, it is a way for citizens there to express themselves. Or should we be turning our attention more to places where internet freedom is genuinely restricted?
I agree. I agree in part to that, because there is generally a censorship problem when it comes to not knowing what should be censored opposed to what shouldn't be censored. And the problem with censoring information online is, for instance, the internet group Anonymous. They've been known for a couple of years to create messages and hack different companies and government industries around the world. And their website is, for instance, blocked here in Saudi Arabia. We're not allowed to look at the website. But I think when it comes to other countries like Iran or in China, the censorship just seems a lot more extreme there. To restrict something that is so beneficial. What Dr. Paula mentioned earlier about when you restrict something, you would restrict the good and the bad as well. I ordered, for example, recently the book by Nietzsche, The Antichrist, just for basically historical reading and reference. And this is a book that you wouldn't find in any bookstore here or in many other countries, actually. And I don't see it as any different when it comes to restricting books than restricting content online.
Haris Rafiq, I'm going to turn to you, Haris Rafiq. That's true, though, isn't it? If you restrict, you're focused on countering extremism, and there needs to be you're advocating a degree of control over some websites. But when you start doing that, you're restricting the good and the bad.
I think there's a difference between censorship and policing. Censorship is where you actually do control people or limit or stop certain websites, a certain interaction happening on the web or on the internet or other forms of media. What I'm talking about is policing, and there's a big difference. I think we'd all agree that some of the other panelists have said that the internet can be used for good and bad. I'm not saying turn off the bad. Look at the riots. Look at the hatred that's on the internet. Look at the crimes that are being committed by using Facebook and Twitter. I'm saying that the police or the internet police or whatever you want to call it, certain levels of morality, certain levels that are universal, certain levels of human rights, these are areas that we should focus on. And I understand there are differences in different countries and different cultures, and I totally disagree with the censorship in Saudi Arabia and China and places like that. But I certainly think that we and the UK should be policing the hatred, the anti-Semitism, the racism, the Islamophobia, and all the different things that are actually on the internet. And we have a duty to do that, both as individuals and as a society.
Padraig Reedy from the Index on Censorship, it is quite nuanced, isn't it? I mean, it's on the one hand, there needs to be a degree of policing. It needs to be legal, but also, I mean, how does an organisation like yours balance the desire for web freedoms with this kind of legal aspect?
We would obviously say that censorship, if it must happen, which we say it probably shouldn't, but if censorship is to happen, if policing of speech does have to happen, it has to be focused and specific and not general. What worries me is in the past few months we have seen a number of convictions for hate speech online and under various acts as public order offences. Now, the problem with that is that I think the authorities in a lot of countries are tending to go after people who say stupid, abusive things on Twitter or on Facebook because it's a very easy conviction to make because all the evidence is laid out there in front of you. And there are people who have been convicted for comments on Facebook and Twitter and so on who would never have been convicted had they said the same things in the street. And so there is a tendency, again, because things are so easy to watch, to monitor, that we will focus all our attention on the easy stuff rather than the hard stuff, which is getting to the real root of problems.
Dr. Paolo Tabaro from the University of Greenwich, I mean, in your investigations into clamping down on the internet and the effect that they had, in the course of your research, have you found that the actual restriction of the restriction of websites seems to have created an entirely new behaviour that is pushing these websites underground?
Yes, and I'm mentioning now another study I did on the websites of people with eating disorders, the so-called pro-ana websites that started being seen in like about 10 years ago. And it wasn't in this case really censorship, but rather fears that because such websites could induce unhealthy behaviors. So some web services banned them even before governments considered outlawing them. And it started with a famous case, Yahoo in the United States in 2001. And in fact, the result is that these websites haven't disappeared at all. They have continued to proliferate. They're now more difficult to identify and locate and reach. But because they're more difficult to reach and identify now, if a public health or nutrition campaign wants to reach out to them and spread more, let's say, healthy messages on how to eat and how to behave, it has more trouble doing that.
Alexei Leonov at the Russian Center for Safe Internet. What sort of websites does your organization target?
Well, we have a hotline, and we receive messages every day with a negative content that the regular users just find while surfing the web. And we have 9 categories of the messages, so we just divide them into 9 categories. For example, it's sexual abuse of minors or images and videos with child pornography. Or, for example, propaganda of drugs. And we always stress that we do not do anything with the political. We're not about political censorship. And when we just started our hotline in 2008, it was a lot of conversations in media about it, and people that you can understand that we have some sort of a Soviet legacy, and where there was a censorship, and well, people have enough of it. And there was a lot of arguments, and there was a lot of conversations that people don't want it more, and they were just mixing it all together, and they considered our hotline to be some sort of regulating instrument, and they said, no, we're not getting it. We don't want it more. Internet must be free, but at the same time, we have to understand that it's sometimes a very dangerous thing, especially for kids. Problem.
But I think no one would quibble with the fact that you're clamping down on criminal behaviour, sexual abuse, and the like. But I mean, in a restricted media environment like Russia, that must be it must be difficult to balance that.
Yeah, sure. But we deal with the law enforcement agencies, and we don't have the right of the law enforcement agency, but we are connected with them, and we are sort of observing and reporting about something wrong in the web, about the negative content that we can find there. And there is a very big difference if we're speaking of, for example, drug propaganda. It's rather easy to understand that it's comes against the law. But if we have some sort of an arguments of political conversations, for example, when there is a forum and the members of this forum just are opposing towards Kremlin, for example, yes, so it's fine. It's just it's a free conversation until they're not coming until they're obeying the law and not doing anything wrong.
You're listening to Voice of Russia. I'm Brendan Cole. Fahaz Fatani in Saudi Arabia. The internet's surely going to have a massive impact on Saudi Arabia in the 10, 15 years to come in a country that's very restricted, isn't it? And do you see, whilst there is some freedom for people who have access to the web, that may change quite quickly? I mean, once the authorities kind of get wind of the level of communication that's taking place online.
Of course, in the last half decade alone, the advances in internet viewing, the increase in internet viewing in Saudi Arabia. At one point, I read an article about how Saudi Arabia had the most YouTube views than any country in the world, which I found very interesting. And we seem to feel a little left out from what's going on in the rest of the world. So YouTube is a very important resource for us. And to think that something like YouTube would one day be censored to us or shut down or policed would certainly be worrying. It would mean that in today's world, many people doubt what information they're getting from different news agencies, given the very vast changes in what we hear from different parts of the world. I'll take the same story. So
I'll throw that to Haris Rafika. YouTube is a powerful, it's a powerful medium in Saudi Arabia. It's also a powerful tool for extremists, isn't it? And that's certainly a problem that your organisation would have to deal with.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, the internet provides extremists a means to create an electronic community of hate. In the internet age, extremists they're no longer isolated from others who share their beliefs, and what they can do is now communicate with thousands or millions of people around the world with just a click of a mouse, and by setting up a website or a film or social media on YouTube. And it's very, very difficult for organizations to monitor YouTube or monitor other websites as well, because when one gets closed down or one actual video or form of media gets closed down or taken off the website, it suddenly reappears in other forms, but with other pseudonyms, etc. But there's another aspect to this as well, Brendan, and this is from a personal perspective, and that's cyberbullying. I remember about 6 years ago, Just as I started on my own personal journey of political activism and looking at extremism, there was a blog that was set up by somebody anonymously, which stated a whole range of lies and untruths about me personally and my organisation, and that spread like wildfire, and that spread to mainstream commentators and a number of others. How could I, as an individual who doesn't have an unlimited amount of resources at my disposal, get to each and every person that wants to republish this blog and eventually get to the individual who's created it when that individual is doing so anonymously? That's quite a serious point for me personally, I think for many others as well.
Padraig Reedy from the Index and Censorship, that's a problem, isn't it? It is a medium of hate.
You have a medium which allows messages to spread faster, but I think in some ways blaming the internet for extremism would have been like blaming the printing press of 100 years ago, or blaming trains for the Russian Revolution. It allows messages, but the message itself is what we have to be looking at. The medium is irrelevant in some ways. And anonymity has always existed. It's always been since things anonymous pamphlets, samizdat, and so on have always circulated. So I don't think that just, as I said at the beginning, we tend to think because it's so easy to shut down a website or to block access to Google or something like that it's a solution. And it rarely is. I don't think it ever is, really.
There was a book published by a journalist called Heather Brooke called The Revolution Will Be Digitized. She describes how the internet provides the technology to create the greatest global democracy ever seen, but equally it can be used to create the greatest totalitarian state. So whichever we end up with depends on the actions taken in the next 5 years. Would you agree with that, Padraig Reedy from the Index and Censorship?
I think the Heather Brooks idea is fascinating, and it's been echoed by many others. The web allows us unprecedented communication, but it also allows those who would want to unprecedented opportunity to monitor our activity. We need to be careful. We need to be neither utopian nor dystopian about the internet and focus on what we're actually saying and how we're saying it, not the medium itself.
Would you agree with that, Paola Tobaro?
To an extent, because it's true that the internet accelerates and facilitates things in a way that we didn't know before. But many of the behaviors we are talking about and many of the controls we've been talking about today existed already before. There have been riots in the 80s. There have been riots and revolutions even before. So the real causes and reasons are not in the internet itself. It's just that the internet might accelerate things that are already there.
Alexei Leonov in Russia, the next 5 years are going to be crucial as to whether or not governments may be able to share quite sensitive information. This is something that your organisation has to be conscious of, isn't it?
Well, I fully agree that the roots of the problem are not in the web, or as the roots are in the governmental structures, are in the society, and so on. Well, internet nowadays just allows to spread one's ideas to millions of people. And it's a brilliant way of connecting to other people, of spreading your thoughts, of just discussing everything. And what we have to think about is just to make our country, our society prosper, and not about the censorship when all the population is in poverty and we're just prohibiting to speak about it on the web. It's the wrong way.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all my guests, the Director of Sentry, Haris Rafiq, Fahis Fatani in Saudi Arabia, Alexei Leonov, Development Director at the Russian Centre for a Safe Internet, Dr. Paolo Tobaro from the University of Greenwich, and Padraig Reedy, the news editor for the Index on Censorship. Thank you very much for joining us here at the Voice of Russia.